I'm Maisie Rockwell, 32 years old, and for most of my life I was the family's emergency contact, the one who showed up, fixed problems, and made sure everything kept moving. For years, I drove my siblings to appointments, handled my parents' paperwork, and dropped everything when they called. But when I texted the family group chat the night before my surgery, "Can someone drive me tomorrow, 5 a.m.?" my brother replied, "Figure it out yourself." Everyone else stayed silent. That was the moment I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or taken for granted by the very people you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being used or overlooked, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, self-worth, and what happens when you finally say no. What happened next might surprise you. I was 32 when I realized I'd been living as the family emergency contact for people who wouldn't cross the street to help me. It didn't happen overnight, this understanding. It accumulated like dust on a windowsill, invisible until you run your finger across it and see exactly how thick the layer has become. Growing up, I was the middle child who learned early that keeping everyone happy meant keeping everyone functional. When mom worked double shifts at the hospital, I made sure my younger brother Jake finished his homework. When dad's back went out, I drove my older sister Rachel to her dance recitals. When the water heater broke and flooded the basement, I was the one who called the plumber, filed the insurance claim, and spent my Saturday hauling waterlogged boxes to the curb. My parents called it responsibility. My siblings called it Maisie being Maisie. I called it normal because I didn't know anything else existed. The pattern followed us into adulthood like a family heirloom nobody wanted, but everyone expected me to maintain. When Jake needed a cosigner for his first apartment, my phone rang. When Rachel's car broke down 3 states away, somehow I was the one coordinating the tow truck and rental car. When mom needed someone to sit with dad during his hernia surgery, the assumption was automatic. Maisie would handle it. I told myself this was what families did. We showed up for each other. We carried each other's burdens. The fact that most of the carrying seemed to flow in one direction was just coincidence, or maybe I was better at managing crises than everyone else. Maybe they really did need me more than I needed them. Jake moved back home twice after college, both times because rent was too expensive and jobs were too hard to find. Each time, I helped him organize his resume, drove him to interviews, and listened to him complain about how unfair everything was. When he finally got hired at a marketing firm, he took me out for dinner to celebrate. He ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and split the check with me down the middle. Rachel went through a series of dramatic breakups that always seemed to require immediate intervention. 3 a.m. phone calls where she sobbed about some man who'd proven himself unworthy of her affection. I'd drive across town to bring her ice cream and tissues, help her change her locks, or simply sit in her living room while she cycled through anger and despair and tentative hope. When she met Dave and their relationship actually worked, the crisis calls stopped. So did most of the other calls. My parents aged into a comfortable assumption that their middle daughter would always be available for the logistics of their lives. Doctor's appointments, prescription pickups, explanation of bills that confused them, troubleshooting of technology that frustrated them. I became fluent in the language of insurance claims and warranty disputes, not because I enjoyed it, but because someone had to do it and I was apparently that someone. The requests came wrapped in guilt and gratitude in equal measure. I hate to bother you, but... followed by something that absolutely needed to happen and couldn't possibly happen without me. Afterward, effusive thanks that felt genuine in the moment, but never quite translated into reciprocal offers of help. I began to notice the imbalance the way you notice a headache, gradually, then all at once. When I mentioned wanting to take a pottery class, mom suggested I was being frivolous with my time. When I had to work late and couldn't drive Jake to pick up his car from the shop, he acted like I'd personally sabotaged his week. When I asked Rachel to help me move furniture, she showed up 2 hours late with a hangover and left after lifting exactly 1 chair. The breaking point came disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoon bureaucracy. I'd spent my lunch break calling 3 different government offices to sort out a property tax confusion for my parents. The automated phone systems ate 45 minutes of my life, transferring me from department to department until I finally reached a human being who could explain that the whole problem stemmed from a form my father had filled out incorrectly 6 months earlier. I called him to explain the solution, feeling proud of my detective work. "Oh, good," he said. "Can you just take care of filing the corrected paperwork? I never understand those forms anyway." Something crystallized in that moment. Not anger, exactly, but a cold clarity. I realized I'd spent 20 years solving problems that weren't mine, managing crises that could have been prevented, and volunteering for responsibilities that nobody else wanted but everybody expected me to want. I started paying attention differently after that. When Jake mentioned his landlord was being unreasonable about a security deposit, I listened sympathetically but didn't offer to call and straighten things out. When Rachel complained about her wedding planner being impossible to reach, I suggested she might need to be more persistent instead of immediately volunteering to take over the communications myself. The shift was subtle at first. Instead of anticipating their needs and volunteering solutions, I waited to be asked directly. Instead of assuming responsibility for outcomes that weren't really mine to control, I offered advice and emotional support, but let them handle the actual work. My family didn't seem to notice the change, which told me everything I needed to know about how much they'd been paying attention to my contributions in the first place. They were used to me saying yes, so they kept asking. They were accustomed to me handling the follow-through, so they kept assuming I would. But I was learning something important about the difference between being needed and being valued. For years, I'd conflated the two, thinking that being indispensable meant being loved. I was beginning to understand that real love doesn't require you to lose yourself in service to other people. Real love doesn't take your availability for granted or treat your competence as a commodity. The revelation should have been liberating, but mostly it felt lonely. If I wasn't the family problem solver, who was I to them? If I stopped showing up in crisis mode, would they still want me around for the regular moments? I was about to find out in the most devastating way possible. The signs had been there for months, scattered like breadcrumbs through ordinary family interactions, but I'd been too busy cleaning up after everyone else to notice the trail leading away from me. It started with response times. Text messages that used to get immediate replies began sitting unread for hours, then days. When I asked Jake about his new job, he'd give me one-word answers and change the subject. When I suggested dinner plans with Rachel, she'd say maybe and never follow up with actual dates. My parents developed a strange new habit of discussing family news without including me in the loop. I'd find out about Jake's promotion from a Facebook post or learn about Rachel's engagement from my aunt calling to ask if I was excited about planning the bridal shower. When I asked Mom why nobody had told me these things directly, she'd act surprised that I didn't already know. "Oh, I thought Rachel mentioned it when you talked last week," she'd say, even though Rachel and I hadn't talked in 3 weeks. The family group chat became particularly revealing. Messages that used to include everyone now seemed to have 2 versions, the full conversation that happened without me and the abbreviated updates I'd receive hours or days later. Inside jokes I didn't understand. References to plans that had been made without my input. A gradual sense that I was watching my own family from the outside of an invisible window. I told myself I was being paranoid. Families go through phases. People get busy with their own lives. The fact that everyone seemed busy with things that didn't include me was probably just coincidence. But coincidence has a way of forming patterns when you pay attention long enough. Jake started asking me for rides with a tone I'd never heard before, casual, almost dismissive, as if my time belonged to him by default. When I couldn't drive him to the airport because I had my own work commitment, he sighed heavily and said, "I guess I'll have to figure something else out then." Like my availability was a service that had been temporarily discontinued rather than a favor that required mutual respect. Rachel began treating my help as an entitlement rather than a gift. When I spent a Saturday helping her paint her new apartment, she complained that I'd chosen the wrong brush size and missed a spot behind the radiator. When I brought groceries during her flu, she critiqued my choice of soup brands and asked why I hadn't thought to bring magazines as well. My parents' requests became more demanding and less grateful. Instead of, "Could you possibly help me with?" it became, "You need to call the insurance company about." Instead of "thank you so much for taking care of that," it became "while you're handling this, could you also?" The most telling moment came during Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I'd driven across town after working a half day, brought dessert, and helped clear the table afterward while Jake and Rachel sat in the living room debating whether to watch football or a movie. As I loaded the dishwasher, I overheard Jake telling Rachel about some complicated situation with his lease renewal. "Just get Maisie to handle it," Rachel said. "She's good at that stuff." "Yeah, she likes doing it anyway," Jake replied. "Gives her something to do." I stood there holding a dinner plate, listening to my siblings discuss my usefulness like I was a service they'd subscribed to rather than a person who chose to help them. The casual assumption that I enjoyed spending my weekends navigating their bureaucratic problems cut deeper than any outright insult could have. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how I'd become the family's designated problem solver, not because I was particularly skilled at it, but because I'd been willing to do it when everyone else was unwilling. Over the years, that willingness had calcified into expectation, and expectation had hardened into entitlement. They didn't see my help as generosity anymore. They saw it as my role, my function, my responsibility. I existed to make their lives easier, and any deviation from that function felt like a betrayal to them rather than a reasonable boundary for me. The realization was clarifying in the most painful way possible. I'd spent 20 years trying to earn love through service, only to discover that the service had become more important to them than the love. I was valued for what I did, not for who I was. I started testing this theory in small ways. When Jake called asking me to research apartment listings for him, I suggested he might enjoy looking himself since it was his future home. When Rachel wanted me to call her credit card company to dispute a charge, I offered to walk her through what questions to ask instead of handling the call myself. These tiny assertions of boundaries were met with confusion and irritation. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of frustrated bewilderment, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language or broken some fundamental rule of family dynamics that I'd previously understood. "Why are you being so difficult lately?" Rachel asked when I suggested she handle her own wedding vendor communications instead of routing everything through me. "You used to be so helpful," Jake complained when I declined to spend my Saturday researching health insurance options for him. They couldn't see that I was still being helpful, I was just no longer doing their work for them. But to my family, apparently, there was no meaningful distinction between those two things. I was beginning to understand that I'd trained them to see me this way by accepting this role for so long. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less when the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally seemed to struggle with loving me when I wasn't convenient. The biggest test was coming, though I didn't know it yet. The morning I got the call from Dr. Martinez's office, I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store, making a mental list of everything I needed to pick up for the week. The scheduler's voice was professionally cheerful as she confirmed my appointment for the gallbladder removal surgery I'd been dreading for months. "Tuesday morning, 5 a.m. check-in," she said. "Remember, you'll need someone to drive you home afterward. The anesthesia effects can last several hours." I'd known this was coming since my diagnosis 6 months earlier, but hearing the actual date made it real in a way that caught me off guard. This wasn't like the minor procedures I'd had before, wisdom teeth removal or a skin biopsy where I could reasonably drive myself if I really needed to. This was actual surgery, the kind that required planning and help and someone who cared enough to sit in a hospital waiting room while I was unconscious. For the first time in my adult life, I genuinely needed my family the way they'd needed me countless times before. I spent the rest of the day thinking about how to approach this. With Jake and Rachel, I'd learned to be direct rather than hoping they'd volunteer. With my parents, I needed to be clear about timing and logistics. The old version of me would have called each person individually, explained the situation thoroughly, and probably apologized for the inconvenience of needing help. Instead, I decided to use the family group chat. It seemed efficient, and frankly, I was curious to see how they'd respond when I needed something for once instead of always being the one offering solutions. That evening, I typed out a simple message: "Surgery tomorrow, 5 a.m., can someone drive me?" I hit send and set my phone aside, feeling strangely nervous about asking for help from people who'd never hesitated to ask me for anything. The response came faster than I expected, but not from the person I'd hoped would answer first. Jake's reply appeared within minutes. "Figure it out yourself." I stared at the screen, certain I'd misunderstood. Those 4 words sat there in the blue text bubble, stark and dismissive, like a slap delivered through digital space. I waited for the follow-up message that would clarify what he meant, or maybe apologize for the harshness of his initial response. No follow-up came. Rachel saw the message, I could tell from the read receipts, but didn't respond. Neither did my parents. The group chat fell silent after Jake's brutal dismissal, as if everyone had simultaneously decided this conversation wasn't worth engaging with. I sat on my couch holding my phone, reading those 4 words over and over until they started to feel surreal. "Figure it out yourself." Said to someone facing surgery the next morning. Said by my brother, who I'd driven to dozens of appointments over the years, who'd never had to figure anything out himself because he'd always known I would handle it. The silence from everyone else was somehow worse than Jake's cruelty. At least his response was a response, even if it was devastating. Rachel, Mom, Dad, they'd all seen my request and chosen to say nothing. Their silence felt like agreement with Jake's dismissal, or worse, like my need for help wasn't even worth acknowledging. I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who'd offered to help with anything I needed after my diagnosis. She agreed immediately to drive me to the hospital, and her kindness made me cry in a way my family's rejection hadn't. That night, I lay in bed thinking about all the times I'd rearranged my schedule for their emergencies, all the early mornings and late nights I'd spent solving their problems, all the ways I'd showed up without being asked, because that's what family was supposed to do. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, finally asking for the kind of help I'd given freely for years, and the response was immediate dismissal. No explanation of conflicting schedules, no apology for not being available, no suggestion of alternatives or offer to help in other ways. Just figure it out yourself, as if needing support was a character flaw I should overcome rather than a reasonable request between family members who supposedly cared about each other. I realized I'd been viewing our relationships through a completely different lens than they had. I'd seen a family that took care of each other, where we all contributed what we could when it was needed. They'd apparently seen a family with designated roles, where I was the designated helper and they were the designated recipients of that help. The surgery went well. Mrs. Patterson brought me magazines and sat with me until I was discharged. She helped me get settled at home and checked on me twice over the next 2 days. She was kind and attentive in ways that put my actual family's behavior into sharp, embarrassing relief. My family's silence stretched into the 2nd day, then the 3rd. No one called to ask how the surgery went or whether I needed anything during recovery. The group chat remained eerily quiet, as if my request had broken something fundamental and everyone was pretending it had never happened. I found myself wondering if they'd forgotten about the surgery entirely, or if they simply didn't care enough to follow up. Both possibilities felt equally devastating. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days after my surgery, my phone started buzzing. The family group chat lit up with messages, not about me or my recovery, but about some crisis that required immediate attention and coordination. I looked at the screen, watching message after message pile up, each one more frantic than the last. They needed help, and they needed it now, and their assumption was clear. Maisie would handle it, just like always. But this time, I made a different choice. This time, I set the phone aside and let it buzz. The messages started innocuously enough. Jake texting the group chat about some paperwork he'd received from the IRS that he didn't understand. Rachel chiming in about a similar notice she'd gotten months earlier that she'd never dealt with. My parents joining the conversation with questions about tax penalties and deadlines that nobody seemed able to answer. Within an hour, the tone shifted from confusion to panic. Apparently, the notices weren't routine correspondence. They were warnings about an audit that could affect several family members due to some shared investment my father had made years earlier. The deadline for response was Friday. Tomorrow. My phone buzzed constantly as the family group chat exploded with increasingly frantic messages. Jake demanding someone explain what the forms meant. Rachel insisting she'd never signed anything and this couldn't possibly apply to her. My parents cycling between anger at the IRS and panic about potential penalties. Someone needs to call the accountant, my mother typed. Maisie always handles this stuff, Jake replied. Maisie, can you call them right now? I was lying on my couch, 3 days post-surgery, watching their messages accumulate like a snowstorm on my screen. The familiar pattern was almost comforting in its predictability. Crisis emerges, panic ensues. Everyone looks to Maisie for solutions. Except this time, I didn't respond. My phone started ringing 20 minutes later. Jake first, then Rachel, then my parents in rapid succession. I let each call go to voicemail, listening to increasingly desperate messages that ranged from demanding to pleading to accusatory. Maisie, I know you're probably busy, but this is really urgent, Jake's first message said, his voice tight with the kind of stress I'd heard 100 times before. By the third call, his tone had changed. Maisie, why aren't you answering? This affects all of us, and you know more about this stuff than anyone else. Rachel's messages were more emotional. Maisie, please call me back. I'm freaking out about this tax thing and I don't know what to do. You always know what to do. My parents' calls were the hardest to ignore. My mother's voice wavering with anxiety, my father's gruff attempts to sound calm while clearly panicking underneath. They'd raised me, invested in my success, celebrated my accomplishments. The fact that they expected me to drop everything and solve their crisis wasn't malicious. It was just how our family had always worked. But that was exactly the problem. I found myself thinking about Tuesday morning, lying in a hospital bed while strangers prepared to cut into my abdomen, and how none of these people who now desperately needed my help had bothered to ask how I was doing. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The calls kept coming. By evening, I had 47 missed calls and dozens of text messages. The family group chat had devolved into a stream of panic and blame, with everyone demanding to know why I wasn't responding and simultaneously arguing about whose responsibility this crisis actually was. Where is Maisie? Rachel typed. She's probably just busy, Mom replied, though even through text I could sense her worry. This is ridiculous, Jake wrote. She always answers her phone. I wanted to respond. The urge to jump in and fix everything was almost overwhelming, not because I particularly wanted to help them, but because 20 years of conditioning had wired me to feel physically uncomfortable when my family was in distress, and I wasn't doing something about it. But every time I reached for my phone, I remembered Jake's message from Tuesday, figure it out yourself. For words that had dismissed my genuine need for help were now echoing back at him in the form of my silence. The irony was almost perfect, except it didn't feel triumphant like I'd imagined it might. It just felt sad. By Friday morning, the missed calls had reached double digits from each family member. The group chat messages had shifted from panic to anger to something approaching genuine concern for my well-being. Apparently, it had finally occurred to them that my silence might indicate something was wrong with me personally, rather than just my unwillingness to solve their problems. Maisie, if you're hurt or sick or something, please just let us know you're okay, Rachel typed. My father called and left a message in his serious voice. Maisie, your mother is worried sick. Just call us back and tell us you're all right. The thing was, I wasn't all right. I was recovering from surgery that they'd forgotten about, dealing with the emotional aftermath of their abandonment when I'd needed them most, and struggling with the realization that my place in the family had been more functional than emotional. But I also wasn't in immediate physical danger, which is what they were really asking about. Their concern wasn't about my emotional well-being or my recovery or whether I felt supported and loved. Their concern was whether I was still alive to help them, because without me, they were discovering they had no idea how to handle their own crisis. That realization crystallized something important. They hadn't been taking my help for granted because they didn't appreciate it. They'd been taking it for granted because they'd become completely dependent on it. I wasn't just the family problem solver, I was the family's only problem solver. For the first time in my adult life, they were being forced to figure something out themselves, and they were panicking because they'd never had to develop those skills. The power dynamic I'd never fully recognized was suddenly, starkly visible. By Friday afternoon, something shifted in the messages. The frantic demands for my immediate attention gave way to a different kind of desperation, not just panic about their tax crisis, but genuine fear about my silence. Maisie, I'm really scared something happened to you, Rachel texted. Please just send me one word so I know you're alive. Jake's messages became increasingly specific. I called your work and they said you took sick days this week. Maisie, if you're in the hospital or something, I can drive down there. Just tell me where you are. My parents' concern escalated to action. My mother called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who assured her I was fine but recovering from surgery. That led to a phone call I could hear through the walls, my mother on Mrs. Patterson's porch, crying as she learned that I'd had my gallbladder removed 3 days earlier while they'd been ignoring my request for help. Surgery? My mother's voice carried through the window. She needed surgery and oh my God, what did we do? The family group chat went quiet for several hours after that. When messages resumed, they were different. Smaller. Uncertain. Maisie, Mom told us about the surgery, Jake wrote. I didn't realize. I thought you were just asking about a ride to an appointment or something. Rachel's message came an hour later. I'm so sorry. I saw your text, but I was dealing with Dave's family drama and I thought someone else would respond. I didn't think about what you actually needed. My father, who rarely texted and never apologized, sent the message that broke something open in my chest. I failed you this week. I'm sorry. I sat on my couch reading these messages, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. Part of me wanted to point out that my original message had been clear. Surgery at 5 a.m. wasn't an appointment. It was a medical procedure that required anesthesia and recovery. Part of me wanted to ask why they'd assumed someone else would respond when there were only 6 people in the group chat, and they were 4 of them. But mostly I felt tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of keeping score, tired of the emotional labor of managing not just their crises, but now their guilt about how they'd handled my crisis. The tax deadline passed without my intervention. I later learned through Mrs. Patterson, who heard it from my mother, that Jake had spent Friday calling accountants until he found one willing to file an emergency extension. Rachel had driven to my parents' house to help them organize their paperwork. My father had taken charge of communicating with the IRS himself. They'd figured it out, just like Jake had told me to do earlier in the week. The difference was that they'd figured it out together, as a family, supporting each other through a stressful situation. They'd done for themselves what I'd been doing for them, individually, for years. I realized I hadn't been helping them so much as I'd been enabling them. By jumping in to solve every problem, I'd prevented them from developing their own problem-solving skills and from learning to rely on each other instead of just on me. My silence hadn't been cruel, it had been necessary. Not as punishment, but as a boundary that allowed them to discover capabilities they'd never had to use before. The revelation was both liberating and heartbreaking. I'd spent 2 decades believing I was indispensable, only to discover that no one is truly indispensable if others are given the space to step up. My family didn't need me as much as I'd thought they did, and they didn't need me in the ways I'd thought they did. But the flip side was equally important. I didn't need their approval or gratitude as much as I'd thought I did. I could be a good daughter and sister without being the designated family crisis manager. I could love them without losing myself in service to them. The missed calls eventually stopped. The group chat messages became less frequent, then shifted to normal family communication, sharing photos, making plans, discussing everyday life without crisis management overtones. Nobody apologized for Jake's "figure it out yourself" message, which told me they either didn't understand how devastating it had been or couldn't figure out how to address it. Nobody directly acknowledged that they'd essentially abandoned me when I'd needed them most, though their guilt was obvious in the careful way they began reaching out. Rachel started calling once a week, just to chat. Jake sent me articles he thought I'd find interesting, with no requests for help attached. My parents began asking about my recovery and my life in general, not just when they needed something handled. It felt like the beginning of something different, though I wasn't sure yet if it would be better or just differently disappointing. What I knew for certain was that I would never again assume that giving help guaranteed receiving it, or that being needed was the same thing as being valued. The surgery scar was healing well, but the emotional incision would take much longer to mend. 3 weeks after the surgery, Rachel called with an invitation that felt like a peace offering wrapped in casual conversation. "Dave and I are making dinner Sunday," she said. Nothing fancy, just pasta and wine. Wanna come over? The old me would have said yes immediately, grateful for any sign that I was still welcome in their lives. The new me paused to consider whether I actually wanted to go. What time? I asked. 6-ish? And Maisie? She paused. Don't bring anything. Just bring yourself. It was a small thing, but significant. For years, I'd been the family member who showed up with groceries, wine, dessert, or flowers. The one who contributed tangible value to every gathering. Rachel telling me not to bring anything felt like recognition that my presence alone had worth. Sunday evening, I drove to Rachel's apartment with empty hands and complicated feelings. Dave answered the door with a warm smile and an immediate apology. Rachel told me what happened with your surgery, he said quietly while she was in the kitchen. I'm really sorry. That must have felt terrible. His acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. Someone had finally named the thing that my family seemed unable to address directly, that what they'd done was hurtful, and that my feelings about it were valid. Dinner was carefully normal. Rachel had clearly briefed Dave on keeping the conversation light, and they both seemed to be working hard to treat me like a guest rather than the family logistics coordinator. When Dave's phone rang, and he started to hand it to me asking if I could help explain something to his insurance company, Rachel caught his arm and shook her head. He can handle it himself, she said, meeting my eyes across the table. After dinner, while Dave loaded the dishwasher, Rachel and I sat on her couch drinking wine and talking around the edges of everything that had happened. I've been thinking about something Jake said, she finally admitted. About how you like doing stuff for us because it gives you something to do. And I realized that was a shitty thing to assume. Like, really shitty. You have plenty of things to do. You have your own life. It wasn't a full apology, but it was acknowledgement, which felt like progress. I think I got confused somewhere along the way, I said. Between helping because I wanted to and helping because I thought I had to. Rachel nodded. And we got confused between asking for help and expecting it. We sat quietly for a moment, both of us looking at the space where a more complete conversation about hurt and forgiveness might happen if we were braver or better at this kind of thing. Mom wants to have you over for Sunday dinner next week, Rachel said eventually. She's been cooking different recipes all week, trying to find something special to make for you. She doesn't need to do anything special. I think she needs to do something. She's been beating herself up pretty badly about the surgery thing. I understood that feeling. I'd spent years beating myself up for not being helpful enough, available enough, convenient enough. Now my mother was discovering what it felt like to realize you'd let someone down when they really needed you. The difference was that I'd been taking responsibility for letting them down even when they hadn't actually needed me. She was taking responsibility for actually letting me down when I genuinely had needed her. Will Jake be there? I asked. Rachel hesitated. Probably. But he's different lately. Quieter. I think the whole thing shook him up more than he's admitting. I wasn't sure I was ready to see Jake yet. His figure it out yourself message had crystallized everything painful about our family dynamic into 4 brutal words. The fact that he was apparently feeling bad about it didn't erase the fact that he'd said it, or what it revealed about how he'd been thinking of me. But avoiding family gatherings forever wasn't a sustainable strategy if I wanted to rebuild any kind of relationship with them. I'll think about it, I said. Rachel walked me to my car, and as I was getting in, she said something that surprised me. You know, that whole tax thing last week? It sucked having to figure it out without you, but it was also kind of, I don't know, empowering? Like, we actually could handle it when we had to. I looked at her in the dim porch light, this sister who'd spent years assuming I'd always be available to manage her crises, and saw something I hadn't seen before, pride in her own competence. You were always capable of handling it, I said. You just didn't have to before. Yeah, she said softly. I'm starting to understand that. Driving home, I thought about the strange mathematics of family relationships, how love and resentment could coexist, how helping someone could hurt them in the long run, how stepping back could sometimes be the kindest thing you could do. Rachel's recognition that she was more capable than she'd realized was exactly what I'd needed to hear, not because it validated my absence, but because it suggested that my presence in their lives could be about choice rather than necessity going forward. If they could handle their own crises, then my help would be a gift rather than an expectation. If they could take care of themselves, then I could take care of myself without guilt. The possibility of loving my family without losing myself in them was starting to feel real for the first time in years. Sunday dinner at my parents' house felt like stepping into a familiar room where someone had rearranged all the furniture. The setting was the same: Mom's good china, the dining room table that had hosted decades of family meals, the smell of her pot roast filling the house, but the emotional geography was completely different. Jake was already there when I arrived, standing awkwardly in the kitchen while Mom bustled around checking various dishes in the oven. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment we just stared at each other across the space where a normal sibling greeting would happen. "Hey," he said finally. "Hey." Mom turned from the stove with the kind of bright, nervous energy she usually reserved for hosting people she wanted to impress. "Maisie, honey, you're here. How are you feeling? Are you hungry? Dinner's almost ready." She hugged me longer than usual, and I could feel her checking to make sure I was really okay, really healed, really not going to collapse from surgical complications she'd failed to attend to. Dad emerged from the living room with a similar energy, overly solicitous, carefully attentive, treating me like an honored guest rather than the daughter who'd been showing up to these dinners for 30 years. "Your usual spot," he said, gesturing to my chair at the table like he was a maitre d' at a restaurant. The whole performance would have been funny if it wasn't so painfully transparent. They were trying to make up for their absence during my surgery by being extra present now, but the effort itself highlighted the absence rather than covering it. Rachel arrived with Dave and a bottle of wine that she handed to Mom instead of automatically giving to me to open and serve. Another small shift in the established patterns. Dinner conversation was carefully orchestrated around safe topics: Dave's new job, Rachel's progress on wedding planning, Jake's apartment search. Nobody asked me about work or my recovery or what I'd been doing with myself lately. I realized they were afraid to make requests of me, even conversational ones, as if asking about my life might be interpreted as asking me to manage theirs again. The avoidance was its own kind of problem. I'd gone from being over-involved in their lives to being treated like a fragile stranger who might break if approached directly. Finally, over dessert, I decided to address the elephant in the room. "You can ask me questions," I said. "And you can tell me about problems you're having. I'm not going to disappear again if you mention that life is complicated sometimes." Jake looked down at his plate. Rachel glanced at Mom. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "We don't want to take advantage," Mom said finally. "There's a difference between taking advantage and having normal family conversations." Dad cleared his throat. "We've been talking about how things were before. How much we asked of you. How much we just assumed. It wasn't sustainable," I said. "For any of us." Jake finally looked up. "I was an asshole that day. When you asked about the surgery. I thought you were just. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd expected from him. "I thought someone else would answer," Rachel added. "Which is stupid, because there were only 6 people in that chat and 4 of them were us. We all thought someone else would handle it," Mom said quietly. "Just like we always thought someone else would handle everything, when really it was always you." The conversation that followed was halting and imperfect, full of false starts and careful navigation around hurt feelings. But it was the first time we'd talked directly about the family dynamics that had been shaping our relationships for years. Dad admitted that he'd started automatically forwarding any confusing mail to me without even trying to understand it himself first. Mom acknowledged that she'd been calling me about things she could have easily figured out on her own if she'd taken the time to try. Rachel and Jake both recognized that they'd been treating my help as a service they were entitled to rather than a favor I was choosing to give. "I don't want to stop helping each other," I said. "But I need it to be reciprocal. And I need to be asked, not just expected to volunteer." "What does that look like?" Rachel asked. It was a good question. I'd been so focused on what I didn't want, the automatic assumption that I'd handle everything, that I hadn't thought carefully about what I did want instead. "I guess it means if you need help with something, you ask specifically for that help instead of just presenting the problem and waiting for me to offer to solve it. And it means sometimes the answer might be no, and that's okay." "And if we need help when you can't give it?" Jake asked. Then you figure it out yourself, or ask someone else, or decide it's not actually urgent enough to deal with right now. Like normal adults do. It sounded harsh when I said it out loud, but Jake nodded slowly. Like we had to do with the tax thing, he said. How did that turn out anyway? Rachel and Jake exchanged glances. It was fine, Rachel said. Stressful, but fine. We got an extension and hired an accountant. It wasn't nearly as complicated as we thought it would be. Most things aren't, I said. The evening ended with tentative plans for future dinners and careful promises to try doing things differently. Nobody made grand gestures or dramatic declarations of change. We were all too tired and too hurt for that kind of optimism. But as I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in relation to my family for a long time, hope that we might be able to love each other better than we had been. The old dynamic had been comfortable for everyone except me, so changing it required them to accept some discomfort in service of my well-being. The fact that they were willing to try suggested that our relationships might be worth more to them than just my usefulness. Time would tell whether the changes would stick or whether we'd gradually drift back into old patterns when the guilt faded and convenience reasserted itself. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice about what kind of daughter and sister I wanted to be, rather than just accepting the role that had been assigned to me by default. The possibility of being loved for who I was rather than what I did was still fragile, still uncertain, but it was no longer unimaginable. 6 months later, I could see the outline of who we were becoming as a family, though the picture was still developing like a photograph in slow motion. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There was no moment when everything clicked into place and we all understood exactly how to love each other better. Instead, it was a gradual recalibration, full of small adjustments and minor failures and incremental improvements. Jake learned to research his own apartment listings, though he still called to ask my opinion about neighborhoods and lease terms. The difference was that he called after doing his own homework, and he accepted my advice as input rather than expecting me to make his decisions for him. Rachel planned her own wedding with minimal crisis management from me, though she did ask me to be her maid of honor in a conversation that felt more like an invitation than an assignment. When her florist canceled 2 weeks before the ceremony, she handled the replacement herself and only told me about it afterward, with pride in her voice as she described solving the problem. My parents developed new habits around their bureaucratic challenges. Dad started reading instructions completely before calling for help. Mom began keeping a list of questions to ask during phone calls with service representatives instead of immediately handing the phone to whoever was closest. The most significant change was in how they all related to my boundaries. When I said no to requests that felt too large or came at inconvenient times, they accepted the no without argument or guilt-tripping. When I suggested they handle something themselves, they took it as confidence in their abilities rather than rejection of their needs. Not everything worked perfectly. There were still moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when Jake started to get frustrated at having to make multiple phone calls about his health insurance, or when Rachel began describing a problem in the tone that used to precede her handing it off to me. But now those moments were followed by course corrections instead of just continuing down the familiar path. Sorry, Rachel said once when she caught herself mid-complaint about her landlord. I'm doing it again, aren't I? Presenting you with a problem instead of just venting about it. Are you looking for advice or sympathy? I asked. Sympathy. Definitely sympathy. It was a small conversation, but it represented a huge shift in how we communicated with each other. The most unexpected development was how much more interesting my family became when they weren't constantly looking to me for solutions. Jake turned out to have excellent negotiation skills when he had to use them. Rachel was more creative and resourceful than I'd realized. My parents were more capable of learning new things than they'd given themselves credit for. I started enjoying their company in ways I hadn't since childhood, before the family crisis management system had solidified around my role as the designated responsible one. My own life expanded to fill the space that had previously been occupied by their emergencies. I took the pottery class I'd mentioned years earlier. I started dating someone I met there, a quiet man named Michael who found it charming rather than concerning that I didn't immediately offer to solve all his problems. You're a good listener, he said after I'd resisted the urge to research solutions for a work situation he was telling me about. I'm learning to be, I said. The phrase that had once devastated me, figure it out yourself, became something I said to myself regularly, but with kindness instead of cruelty. When I caught myself about to volunteer for responsibilities that weren't mine, I'd pause and think, maybe I should let them figure this out themselves. Not because I didn't care, but because caring doesn't always mean fixing. The hardest part was learning to tolerate the discomfort of watching people I loved struggle with problems I could solve. There were still moments when Jake would spend days researching something I could have answered in 5 minutes, or when my parents would get frustrated with technology one could have navigated easily. But I began to understand that solving their problems for them had been preventing them from developing confidence in their own problem-solving abilities. My help had been making them less capable rather than more capable, more dependent rather than more independent. The surgery scar had faded to a thin line across my abdomen, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. But the emotional scar from that morning when I'd needed them and they dismissed me, that was taking longer to heal. I still thought about it sometimes, usually when I was deciding whether to trust them with something vulnerable. The memory served as a useful reminder that love and reliability aren't always the same thing, and that I needed to protect myself even within relationships I valued. But I also learned that people could change, that family dynamics weren't permanently fixed, and that it was possible to forgive someone without forgetting what they'd taught you about who they were when you really needed them. The phone calls came less frequently now, but they were better calls. Instead of crisis management sessions, they were actual conversations about our lives, our thoughts, our experiences. Instead of feeling like the family emergency hotline, I felt like a person with relationships that included both giving and receiving. Rachel's wedding was small and lovely, and I gave a toast that focused on her growth and happiness rather than all the problems I'd helped her solve over the years. Jake bought his first house and asked for my advice about mortgage options, but he made the final decision himself and seemed proud of owning that choice completely. My parents celebrated their 40th anniversary with a party they planned themselves, and when the caterer had a last-minute issue, they handled it with the kind of calm confidence that made me realize they'd always been capable of this. They'd just never had to be. At the end of that party, as I was helping clean up dishes, because I wanted to, not because anyone expected me to, my mother pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago, about needing things to be reciprocal," she said. "I realized I never learned how to help you because you never seemed to need help. I needed help sometimes. I just got used to not asking for it." "Well," she said, "I'm asking now. What do you need?" It was such a simple question, but no one in my family had asked it in years. I thought about it carefully. "I need to know that you'll show up if I really need you to," I said finally. "And I need to know that you value me for more than just what I can do for you." "Done," she said, as if those were easy promises to make and keep. Maybe they were easier than I'd thought they would be. Maybe the hard part had been figuring out what I needed rather than asking for it. Standing in my parents' kitchen, washing dishes next to my mother while the rest of the family laughed in the living room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I belonged to this family by choice rather than just by obligation. The relationships weren't perfect, and they probably never would be. But they were honest now in ways they hadn't been before, and that honesty made room for the kind of love that didn't require anyone to lose themselves in service to it. I'd learned that silence could be its own form of communication, that sometimes the most powerful response to being taken for granted was simply not being available to be taken for granted anymore. But I'd also learned that people could change when they were given both the motivation and the space to do so, and that families could recover from even significant betrayals if everyone was willing to do the work of rebuilding trust. The woman who had sat in her car 6 months earlier, reading Figure It Out Yourself and feeling utterly alone in the world, was still part of me. But she was no longer the only part of me, and she was no longer the part that got to make all the decisions about how much of myself I gave away and to whom. I had learned, finally, to figure it out myself, not just the logistics of getting to surgery or managing crises, but the much more complicated question of how to love people without disappearing in the process. The answer, it turned out, was boundaries. Clear, consistent, kindly enforced boundaries that made space for everyone to be whole people rather than just functions in each other's lives. It had taken a long time to get there, and the journey had been more painful than I'd expected. But the destination, A family that chose each other rather than just used each other was worth every difficult conversation and every moment of uncomfortable silence along the way. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the opportunity to prove they don't actually need you as much as they think they do. And sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the discovery that you don't need their approval as much as you thought you did. The phone still rang, but now when it did, I knew I had the power to choose whether to answer it. That choice, more than any individual decision I made with it, had changed everything. That was my breaking point, and the moment I stopped being the family's fixer. What about you? Have you ever been ignored or dismissed when you finally needed help? Did it change the way you saw your family or your role in it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if you connected with mine, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-worth, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. You don't always have to be the one who saves everyone else.